My parents hid the truth for 26 years. What I discovered tore my family apart and changed everything, and then I'm Ethan, a 26-year-old software developer living in Chicago. My life was ordinary, or at least it felt that way. I had a decent job, a small apartment downtown, and a family I thought was as solid as any. My parents, Grace and Charles, had been married for 32 years, and while they weren't exactly the picture-perfect couple, they were stable. Or so I thought. It all started with a phone call. My mom, Grace, called me one afternoon while I was finishing up some work. Her tone wasn't the usual cheery warmth I'd expect from her. She sounded curt, almost distant. "Ethan, I need you to come home for dinner tomorrow night," she said. 7 o'clock. "It's important." "What's going on?" I asked, but she didn't elaborate. "Just be there. Your brother's coming too." I hung up feeling uneasy. Grace was the type to chat endlessly about her latest garden projects or the new recipes she was trying, but there was none of that this time. Something was off. The next evening, I drove out to my parents' place in the suburbs. Their house was a cozy two-story with flower beds Grace tended meticulously. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw my older brother Ryan's car parked outside. He'd driven in from Detroit, where he worked as a high school teacher. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Grace was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew with a tight-lipped expression, while Charles sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Hey," Ryan greeted me quietly as I walked in. "Do you know what's going on?" I shook my head. "No clue." "You?" He just shrugged, and we exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. We sat down for dinner, but the usual warmth of our family meals was nowhere to be found. The clinking of silverware against plates was the only sound, and even the food tasted bland in the oppressive silence. Grace finally broke it, putting her fork down and looking at us with a shaky breath. "Your father and I have something to tell you," she said, her voice trembling. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Ryan stopped eating too, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. Grace continued, "We're getting divorced." For a moment, I thought she was joking. My parents had been together for over 3 decades. They weren't the most affectionate couple, but they never fought. Not that I'd seen, anyway. I laughed nervously. "Wait, what?" But the look on her face told me she wasn't kidding. My stomach dropped. Ryan recovered first. "What do you mean, divorced? Since when?" "It's been coming for a while," Grace said, avoiding eye contact. "We've grown apart." "Grown apart?" Ryan repeated, his voice rising. "After 32 years?" Charles, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "It's not that simple, Ryan." His tone was flat, like he didn't have the energy to argue. "That's all you're giving us? It's not that simple?" Ryan snapped. I couldn't say anything. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was hearing. My parents, divorcing? It didn't make sense. There hadn't been any signs. No arguments, no tension that I'd noticed. After dinner, Ryan and I sat in the living room, still trying to wrap our heads around it. Charles had retreated to his study, and Grace disappeared upstairs. "What the hell just happened?" Ryan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," I said, "but something's not adding up." Just then, our aunt, Diane, pulled me aside. She'd always been the nosy one in the family, the type who loved to stir the pot. But this time, she looked genuinely concerned. "I think there's more to this," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "There's talk about a child." "A child?" I repeated, frowning. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "I don't know the details, but there are rumors about your father and someone else. Something from years ago." I didn't know what to make of it, but the idea stuck in my head. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were spinning, trying to piece together what little I knew. Around midnight, I heard raised voices from my parents' bedroom. I crept closer to the door, my heart pounding. Grace's voice was sharp and angry. "I've had enough of your secrets, Charles. You've been hiding this for decades." "I didn't cheat." Charles shot back, his voice weary but defensive. "I've told you that 1,000 times. Then explain the trips." Grace yelled. Explain the photo. I backed away, my pulse racing. The photo? What photo? The next morning, I decided to snoop. While Charles was out, I went into his study and started rifling through his desk. In the bottom drawer, tucked under some old documents, I found it, a torn photograph. It showed Charles holding a baby. The child wasn't Ryan or me. It couldn't be. The date on the back was from 1993, just a few months before I was born. My hands shook as I stared at it. Who was this child? Why was the photo torn in half? And why had Charles kept it hidden? I showed the picture to Grace that afternoon, and her reaction stunned me. She stared at it for a long moment, her face pale, then she burst into tears. I knew it, she said, her voice breaking. I always knew. Knew what? I demanded, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stormed upstairs and came back with a stack of old financial records. I'm filing for divorce immediately, she said, her voice cold and determined. And I'm hiring a lawyer to dig into everything. If he's been lying to me for this long, who knows what else he's hiding? Ryan, who had just walked into the room, looked at the photo in my hand and then at Grace. Do you think he has another family or something? He asked, half joking. But I could see the worry in his eyes. I don't know, I said quietly. The rest of the day was a blur of tension and arguments. Grace insisted Charles take a DNA test to prove his innocence, while Charles refused, saying it wasn't necessary. The accusations flew back and forth, and Ryan and I were stuck in the middle. By the end of the night, Charles had packed a bag and left, saying he needed space. Grace stayed behind, seething, while Ryan and I sat together, trying to figure out what to do. For the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't recognize my family. The morning after Charles left, the house felt eerily quiet. Grace barely came out of her room, and Ryan and I spent most of the day in silence, avoiding the tension that hung over everything. My mind kept circling back to that torn photograph, the argument I'd overheard, and my mother's cryptic comments. It didn't feel like we were getting the whole story, only bits and pieces of something much bigger. By the afternoon, I couldn't take the silence anymore. Ryan and I sat down in the living room, where sunlight filtered through the curtains, giving the room a false sense of peace. We need to figure out what's going on, I said, breaking the silence. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. And how do we do that? It's not like Mom or Dad is giving us any real answers. I don't know, I admitted. But I'm not just going to sit here and let this blow up without trying to understand it. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Okay, Sherlock, where do we start? The DNA test, I said after a pause. Ryan looked at me sharply. You're serious? Why not? Mom brought it up last night, and honestly, it might be the only way to get any clarity. If Dad's hiding something, or if Mom's been keeping secrets, we need to know. It took some convincing, but Ryan eventually agreed. That evening, I ordered a DNA test kit online. As I hit confirm, a strange mix of excitement and dread settled over me. I wasn't sure what I wanted the results to say. A few days later, the kit arrived. Grace didn't even blink when I told her I planned to take the test. In fact, she encouraged it. Good, she said, her voice clipped. Maybe this will finally force your father to come clean. Charles, on the other hand, was furious when he found out. I called him to tell him what I was doing, expecting resistance, but his reaction caught me off guard. You don't need to take that test, he said firmly. Why not? I challenged. Because you already know the truth, he said, his voice strained. You don't need a piece of paper to tell you who you are. The words stuck with me long after the call ended. Did I know the truth? And if I did, why did everything feel so wrong? Meanwhile, Ryan dropped another bombshell. One night, as we sat in my apartment, he told me he'd overheard Grace on the phone again. She was talking to someone, he said, lowering his voice. I couldn't hear much, but she kept saying, "This child ruined everything." Do you think she was talking about me? I asked, my stomach twisting. I don't know, Ryan admitted. But if she was... He didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't push him. When the DNA results finally came back, I opened the email with trembling hands. Ryan sat next to me, his face tense as he waited for me to speak. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. The results were clear. I shared no DNA with Charles. 0? Ryan asked, leaning over to look at the screen. None, I whispered, my throat dry. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan let out a shaky breath and muttered, "Holy shit." I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to cry. Another part wanted to scream. Charles had been my father for 26 years. How could he not be? We decided to show the results to Grace together. When we handed her the printout, she didn't even look surprised. Instead, she crumpled onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. "I always knew," she said between sobs. "Deep down, I always knew." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Then why didn't you say anything?" I demanded. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "Because I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to lose the life we had." Charles's reaction, however, was the complete opposite. When we showed him the results, he didn't cry or yell. He just stared at the paper in silence. "Is that all you're going to say?" I asked, my voice rising in frustration. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "It's not what you think." Then he walked away, leaving me and Ryan more confused than ever. Later that week, I was in Charles's study again, searching for anything that might give me answers. That's when I found it, a second photograph. This one was intact and showed Grace standing next to a man I didn't recognize. She looked younger, happier, and the two of them were smiling like they shared some secret. I showed the picture to Ryan. "Do you know who this is?" I asked. His eyes widened. "That's Tom, Mom's old boyfriend." I blinked. Mom never mentioned a Tom. "She wouldn't have," Ryan said bitterly. "He wasn't really in the picture by the time you came around. But I remember him. He used to visit when I was little. Everyone called him Uncle Tom, but he wasn't actually related to us. He disappeared when you were a baby." A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Could this man be my biological father? When I confronted Grace with the photograph, her reaction said it all. She froze, her eyes darting to the picture and then to me. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "In Dad's study," I said. "Who is he?" Grace hesitated, then finally admitted the truth. Tom had been her boyfriend before she met Charles. They'd been deeply in love, but things didn't work out. She insisted, however, that Charles was the only man she had ever truly loved. Then why was this photo hidden? I pressed. She didn't answer, and her silence spoke volumes. Over the next few days, word about the DNA results spread through the family. Relatives started calling, everyone with their own opinions about what had happened. Some blamed Charles for keeping secrets. Others pointed fingers at Grace. Then, out of nowhere, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, just my name on the front. Inside, it read, "You deserve to know the truth." That was it. No signature, no explanation, just those 6 words. When I showed the letter to Grace, she turned pale. "Don't pay attention to this," she said quickly. "It's just someone trying to stir up trouble." But I couldn't ignore it. The timing was too strange. Someone out there knew more than they were letting on, and I was determined to find out who and what they knew. The mysterious letter sat on my desk for days, its cryptic message looping through my mind like a broken record. Who had sent it, and what truth were they talking about? Every time I tried to set it aside, something about it pulled me back. Grace's reaction when she saw it wasn't just fear. It was panic. It was clear she was hiding something, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered it. As I dug deeper into my parents' past, I kept coming back to the man in the photo, Tom. Uncle Tom, as Ryan had called him, wasn't just a forgotten family friend. He was the missing piece in this whole puzzle. I decided to track him down. It wasn't easy. Grace refused to talk about him, and Charles stayed silent, as always. But Ryan remembered enough to give me a starting point. Tom had lived in St. Louis back when he and Grace were together. Using what little information I had, I scoured social media, old phone directories, and even some genealogy sites. After weeks of searching, I found a possible lead. A man named Thomas Riley, now living in a small town in Missouri. I sent him a message, not expecting much. To my surprise, he replied within a day. "I've been waiting to hear from you," the message read. "We need to talk." My heart raced as I read his response. Waiting to hear from me? What did that mean? We agreed to meet in St. Louis, at a coffee shop near the train station. The day of the meeting, I could barely focus. I took an early train from Chicago, the entire ride filled with a mix of anticipation and dread. When I arrived at the cafe, Tom was already there. He looked older than the photo I'd found, with graying hair and tired eyes, but there was no mistaking him. He stood up as I approached, offering a tentative smile. "Ethan," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm, but his voice carried a note of hesitation. "Tom," I replied, my voice stiff. We sat down, the tension between us almost tangible. For a moment, neither of us spoke, but then he broke the silence. "I never thought I'd get the chance to meet you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your mother. She made sure of that." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Tom leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Grace and I were together a long time ago. We were young, in love, and, well, she got pregnant. She told me about it, but then she disappeared. One day, she just packed up and left. The next thing I knew, she was married to Charles. She told me she'd lost the baby." I froze, the weight of his words settling over me. "She told you she miscarried?" He nodded. "For years, I believed her. I had no reason not to. But when I saw your photo, when I heard about the DNA test, I started putting things together. It all started to make sense. Grace's secrecy, Charles's silence, even the torn photograph. It was all tied to Tom. Why didn't you fight for her?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I tried," Tom said quietly, "but she made it clear I wasn't part of her plan anymore. She wanted stability, and Charles could give her that. I couldn't." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out at him for not doing more, but another part of me felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. There was a reason my family felt like it was built on lies, because it was. When I got back to Chicago, I told Ryan everything. He sat in stunned silence as I recounted my conversation with Tom, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger. "She lied to him," he said finally, "and to us." "I don't think it's that simple," I said. Ryan gave me a hard look. "Isn't it? She lied about who your father is. She lied to Tom about losing you. She lied to Dad. How many more lies do we need before it is that simple?" I didn't have an answer. Things came to a head at the next family gathering. Grace had insisted on hosting a barbecue, as if pretending everything was normal would somehow fix the chaos. But normal was the last thing this was. The backyard was filled with relatives, most of whom already knew about the DNA test. Whispers followed me everywhere I went, and the occasional pointed glance made it clear what they were talking about. Ryan finally snapped during dinner. "Why don't we just talk about the elephant in the room?" he said, slamming his beer down on the table. "Ryan," Grace warned, her tone low and threatening. "No, Mom," he shot back. "Everyone's already talking about it. So why don't you just tell the truth?" The table fell silent. All eyes were on Grace, who sat frozen, her face pale. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said finally. "How about the truth?" Ryan pressed. "About Tom. About Ethan. About everything you've been hiding for the last 26 years. Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the patio. "This isn't the time or the place," she snapped. "Then when?" Ryan demanded. "When are you going to stop pretending everything's fine?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stormed inside, leaving the rest of us sitting in awkward silence. Later that night, I received an email from Tom. Attached were a series of letters Grace had written to him years ago, back when she was pregnant with me. In the letters, she talked about her fears, her doubts, and her decision to leave him. She mentioned making sacrifices for the baby's future and choosing stability over love. When I showed the letters to Grace the next day, she broke down. "I did what I thought was best," she said through tears. "I didn't want you to grow up in chaos. Charles could give us a good life. I thought it was the right thing to do." "And Dad?" I asked. "When did he find out?" Her silence told me everything. Years ago, she admitted finally. "But he chose to stay. He didn't want to lose you, Ethan. He loved you like his own, even after he knew." I didn't know what to say. The weight of her words crushed me. All this time, Charles had known the truth. All this time, he'd been living a lie for me. But the revelations didn't stop there. As if my family hadn't been through enough, Tom dropped another bombshell. There might be another sibling. She never told me the details, he said in his email. But before she left, she mentioned another child. I don't know if it's true, but I thought you should know. Another sibling. Another secret. I didn't know how much more I could take. The idea of another sibling gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the thought, no matter how much I tried to focus on work or distract myself with friends. Tom's message about a possible second child threw everything into chaos again. Just when I thought the dust was starting to settle, I decided to confront Grace directly. This time, I wasn't going to let her dodge the questions or shut me down with vague excuses. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, peeling vegetables with a robotic efficiency that made it clear she was trying to keep her hands busy. "Mom," I said firmly as I walked in, "we need to talk." She didn't look up. "About what, Ethan?" "Another child," I said, watching her closely. Her hands froze, the vegetable peeler clattering to the counter. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she sighed and turned to face me, her expression weary. "Where did you hear that?" she asked softly. "Tom," I said. "He told me you mentioned it to him years ago. Is it true?" Grace pressed her lips together, her eyes darting to the window as if searching for an escape. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's true." My chest tightened. "Who? When?" She took a deep breath. "Before I met Charles, I got pregnant. I wasn't ready to be a mother, and Tom wasn't in a position to help. I gave the baby up for adoption. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but at the time, I thought it was the only choice." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. A sibling, out there somewhere, a part of my family I'd never known about. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I asked, my voice cracking. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Because it hurt too much. I tried to move on, to build a life with Charles, and give you and Ryan the family you deserved. I didn't want to bring up the past and risk losing everything." Her words felt like a slap in the face. Grace had spent decades keeping secrets, and every one of them had been like a bomb waiting to explode. I left the house that day more determined than ever to find the truth. If there was another sibling out there, I was going to find them. Ryan was hesitant at first when I told him my plan to dig into adoption records. "Do you really think this is a good idea?" he asked. "What choice do we have?" I countered. "We deserve to know." He eventually agreed, and together, we started sifting through every clue we could find. Grace wasn't exactly forthcoming with details, but she gave us enough to narrow down a time frame and location. It was like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, with gaps we had to fill in with educated guesses. After weeks of searching, we finally found something, a record of a baby boy born in 1988 in St. Louis and placed with an adoption agency. Using this information, I submitted a request for a DNA test through an ancestry website. The results came back faster than I expected. When I opened the email, my heart pounded. It wasn't a boy. It was a woman, a 31-year-old veterinarian named Bethany who lived in Denver. The DNA match confirmed that she was my half-sister. I stared at her profile picture, a smiling woman with brown hair and kind eyes, and felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. Would she even want to meet me? I sent her a message, explaining who I was and what I'd discovered. The response came a few days later. She was polite but cautious, saying she'd never known she was adopted and needed time to process everything. Eventually, Bethany agreed to meet me. We decided on a neutral location, a quiet park near her home in Denver. I booked a flight and told Ryan what I was doing. He wanted to come, but I convinced him to stay behind. I felt like this was something I needed to do on my own. When I arrived at the park, Bethany was already there, sitting on a bench under a tree. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. "Ethan?" she asked hesitantly. "That's me," I said, smiling nervously. She stood up, and we shook hands awkwardly. Then we sat down, and the conversation began. Bethany was still reeling from the revelation. She told me she'd always felt like something was off about her childhood, but she'd never been able to pinpoint what it was. Her parents had never mentioned anything about adoption. Finding out like this, "It's a lot," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "I get it," I said. Believe me, my family has been nothing but chaos lately. She laughed softly, and the tension eased a little. Over the next hour, we talked about our lives, our families, and the strange twists of fate that had brought us together. When I got back to Chicago, I told Grace about the meeting. Her reaction was exactly what I expected. "You had no right to contact her," she said angrily. "Are you serious?" I shot back. "She's my sister. Don't I deserve to know her?" "She's not your sister," Grace snapped. "She was adopted by another family. That was the deal. You had no business dragging her into this mess." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Grace was still trying to control the narrative, even after everything that had come out. To my surprise, Charles took my side. "It's time to stop hiding, Grace," he said quietly. "They deserve to know the truth." Grace looked at him, her face a mixture of anger and hurt. Then she turned and walked out of the room without another word. Bethany and I kept in touch, growing closer with each phone call. She even started talking to Tom, who was thrilled to connect with her. Watching the two of them bond was bittersweet. On one hand, it was heartwarming to see them build a relationship. On the other, it was a painful reminder of everything Grace had kept from us. Then Bethany dropped another bombshell. She'd received an anonymous letter, just like the one I'd gotten weeks earlier. It warned her to stay away from the past and not to dig deeper into her origins. The handwriting matched the letter I'd received. When I told Ryan about it, he shook his head. "What the hell is going on, Ethan? Who's sending these letters?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm going to find out." The anonymous letters felt like a final taunt, a cruel reminder that the chaos wasn't over. Someone out there still wanted to keep the past buried, but their attempts only fueled my determination to uncover the full truth. I started by investigating the letter Bethany received. Like mine, it had no return address, but the postmark was from Chicago. The similarity in handwriting was unmistakable. Whoever sent these letters knew far more than they were letting on. Bethany mailed me her letter, and once I had it in hand, I compared it to mine. The handwriting wasn't just similar, it was identical. I took the letters to a handwriting expert, who confirmed they'd likely been written by the same person. The next step was finding out where they came from. I contacted the post office where the letters had been postmarked, hoping they might have information. The clerk wasn't particularly helpful at first, but as I described the situation, he softened. "There's a P.O. box associated with that postmark," he said finally. "I can't give you the owner's name, but," he hesitated, then slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was a partial address, a clue. Back home, I plugged the address into Google Maps. My heart sank when I saw the result. It led to a storage facility just outside the city. When I arrived at the storage facility, the manager told me they couldn't disclose who rented the unit associated with the address. Frustrated, I left empty-handed but more determined than ever. Back at my apartment, I stared at the letters, trying to piece it all together. Then something clicked, the handwriting. It was familiar, not in a vague way, but intimately so. I grabbed a stack of old birthday cards from Grace and rifled through them. My chest tightened as I made the comparison. The handwriting was hers. I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. Grace, my mother, had written the letters. She was the one trying to scare me, and Bethany, away from the truth. When I confronted her, the look on her face confirmed it before she even spoke. "I was trying to protect you," she said defensively. "From what?" I demanded. "The truth? You've been lying to us for decades, Mom. What more could you possibly be hiding?" Her composure cracked, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Then help me understand," I said, my voice softer but still firm. She looked up, her eyes filled with a strange mix of guilt and defiance. "I wrote the letters because I didn't want you digging into things that would only hurt you. Bethany's life was fine without us, without me. I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" I said incredulously. "Mom, you've done nothing but lie to us. To Dad. To everyone." Grace didn't respond. The fallout from that confrontation was immediate. Ryan was livid when I told him, and Bethany was equally furious. She called Grace directly, demanding an explanation. Grace refused to answer, retreating further into her own bubble. Charles, however, surprised me. He reached out to Bethany, inviting her to dinner. For the first time, the four of us, me, Ryan, Charles, and Bethany, sat down together without Grace. Charles treated Bethany like she'd always been part of the family. It was a bittersweet moment, seeing him embrace her so openly. He told stories about our childhoods, reminiscing about the good times, and even joked about how chaotic things had become. "I don't know what the future holds," he said that night, "but I do know this. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up, who care, and who choose to stay." It was the most candid I'd ever seen him, and it made me appreciate him even more. Meanwhile, Tom was thrilled to reconnect with Bethany. He started visiting her in Denver regularly, making up for lost time. Watching them build a relationship was both heartwarming and painful. It reminded me of everything Grace had stolen from us. Then came one final twist. Bethany called me late one night, her voice shaking. "I got another letter," she said. "What does it say?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "It's not like the others," she said. "It's shorter. It just says, 'There's more.'" "What do you think it means?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "But I don't think this is over." The letter didn't have Grace's handwriting. This time, it was someone else. Feeling the weight of yet another secret, I knew I couldn't stop now. I reached out to the storage facility again, this time with Bethany's help. She was able to confirm the unit associated with the address was still active. Together, we decided to pay another visit. When we arrived, we explained the situation to the manager, who reluctantly agreed to let us look inside the unit after showing identification. The space was small, cluttered with old boxes and furniture. In one corner, we found a locked filing cabinet. We managed to pry it open with a screwdriver we'd brought, and what we found left us speechless. Dozens of letters, photographs, and documents, all connected to Grace's past. Among them were adoption papers for Bethany, receipts for Tom's financial contributions, and a series of unsent letters from Grace to Tom, apologizing for cutting him out of her life. The most shocking discovery, however, was a third birth certificate. The name listed wasn't mine or Bethany's. It was a name we didn't recognize, and the date was from 1990. Another sibling. As I stared at the document, my mind raced. Who was this person? Where were they? And why had Grace hidden them too? I called Ryan immediately, filling him in. He was silent for a long time before finally saying, "This just doesn't end, does it?" "No," I said. "It doesn't." That night, I sat with the birth certificate and the letters, wondering how many more secrets my family could possibly have. The past few months had shattered everything I thought I knew about my parents, about myself, about what it meant to be part of a family. And yet, despite all the lies and betrayal, there was a strange sense of hope. Bethany, Charles, and I had started to rebuild something new, something honest. Tom was stepping into his role as a father in a way I never expected. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. But as I stared at the birth certificate in my hands, one thought lingered. The story wasn't over. Not yet.